It's 11 at night. The kitchen light is on. Somewhere under the sink, a drip that started as a tap has become a thin, steady line of water. 2 towels are on the floor. A plastic bucket sits between the pipes. The sound isn't loud. It doesn't have to be. It's constant. You crouch down. You reach behind the cold water line and find the shut-off valve. It resists. Then it moves. The pressure changes. The drip pauses. And then, a moment later, water appears somewhere else further back, behind the panel, where your hand can't reach without pulling the cabinet apart. You press the wood. It gives. Not much. Just enough to tell you it's been wet longer than tonight. There's an assumption in the room. You can feel it even though no one else is here. The assumption is, call someone. And right behind it, like a second voice in a conversation that doesn't exist, is another assumption. Someone will ask, who should we call? There is no we. There hasn't been a we in this house. Not tonight. Not last year. Not when the furnace cycled 3 times in January and you sat on the basement stairs at 2 in the morning reading the manual. Not when the roof estimate came in and you stood in the driveway doing math you didn't want to do. The repair itself is not just a bill. It's a chain. Diagnosis, authorization, scheduling, presence at the house during work hours, risk acceptance if the contractor cuts corners, follow-up if the fix doesn't hold. Each link in that chain assumes a person, sometimes 2. The property doesn't care whether you're independent. It doesn't recognize independence. It recognizes ownership. And ownership means the chain lands on one set of hands. Here's the recognition that arrives quietly, standing in that kitchen with a damp towel under your foot. The hard part isn't the pipe. It's not even the cost. It's the coordination, the entire second layer of logistics that exists because there is no second person. You are the project manager, the client, the on-site supervisor, and the one who has to take a half day from work to let a stranger into your home. If a house can require 2 adults without ever saying so, what else in your life has the same hidden expectation? The bucket isn't the problem. The problem is the system. A structure that depends on one body, one signature, one calendar, one cognition. And when any one of those is interrupted by fatigue, by illness, by a Tuesday afternoon meeting that can't be moved, the chain stalls. That question stays open. We'll come back to it. But first, let's look at what the outside of this life actually looks like. Because from the outside, it looks fine. More than fine. The mortgage is paid off, or close to it. The lawn gets cut. The gutters get cleaned, maybe once a year, maybe every other year, but they get cleaned. The car is maintained. The bills are automated. There's a rhythm to the weeks that would look, to anyone watching, like the kind of stability most people spend decades trying to build. There's a job or a career or a business, something that provides, something that structures the day and funds the rest. The work identity may have shifted over the years, fewer ambitions about titles, more interest in consistency, but it holds. It produces income. It fills hours. It gives you a reason to be dressed by 8. And underneath all of it, running like a wire through every wall in the house, is one operating principle. You may not say it out loud. You may never have put it into words. But it governs everything. I handle it. That principle has worked. It has worked for a long time. It worked when you were 32 and bought the house. It worked when you were 41 and replaced the water heater over a weekend because the quote was absurd and you found a tutorial that made sense. It worked when you were 47 and dealt with a tax issue that would have sent most people to an accountant, but you read the IRS guidance yourself and filed the amendment. I handle it is not a complaint. It's not a boast. It's a structural fact. It's the way the system runs. And because it has always worked, it has never been questioned. Let's stay with the house for a while, because the house is where this becomes visible first. A contractor estimate is not a number. People think it is. They think you get 3 quotes and pick the middle one, and that's the decision. But the estimate is actually a commitment. It's a commitment to grant access someone needs a key or you need to be home. It's a commitment to oversight. You need to verify the scope matches the work. It's a commitment to dispute resolution. If the tile is wrong, if the drywall doesn't match, if the electrician nicks a wire, you are the one who has to notice, object, negotiate, and follow through. And it's a commitment to guarantee enforcement. If the work fails in 6 months, you're the one who calls, documents, and possibly sues. In a 2-adult household, those commitments get distributed. One person handles the scheduling. The other handles the site visits. One person tracks the invoice. The other checks the work. It's not always clean or equal, but there's a second pair of eyes, a second nervous system noticing things. In a one-person system, every small repair becomes project management. The house is not an object. It's a system. And you are operating that system without a co-pilot. Not because you failed to find one. Not because something went wrong. Just because that's how the structure settled. This is where the first layer of something important appears. There's a common idea that single living is primarily a financial challenge. And for some people, it is. But for a man over 50 who has built a stable career, the money is usually handled. Not extravagantly, but handled. The bills get paid. The savings exist. The retirement account grows at whatever rate the market allows. Financially, the structure appears sound. But financial analysis misses the real exposure. The real redundancy in a household is not cash, it's coverage. A second set of hands when the pipe bursts at 11 at night. A second calendar that can absorb a Tuesday morning contractor visit without disrupting a work schedule. A second set of eyes that notices the cabinet wood is soft before the damage spreads. Cash is one form of resilience. Coverage is another. And coverage is what a single operator household quietly lacks, not because the operator is deficient, but because the architecture doesn't allow for it. Now here's where the identity layer enters. In a traditional household, the provider role has an audience. There's someone who sees the bills get paid, someone who benefits directly from the stability, someone who says, even if only through presence, this system works because you sustain it. For a man living alone past 50, the provider role doesn't disappear. The instinct to maintain, to fund, to keep the structure sound. That instinct is still running, but there's no audience, no acknowledgement loop. No one sees the effort, and no one offers a shift change. You are the provider, and you are the household, and you are the one being provided for. All three roles collapse into one body. The work doesn't decrease, it just becomes invisible. Even to you, especially to you. Because when you've done it long enough, the effort stops registering as effort. It registers as normal, but the body still carries it. Let's talk about the house as a financial object for a moment. Because there's a specific kind of exposure that shows up when a single person holds a property. The house is stability. Everyone says this. Equity builds. The mortgage shrinks. The value, over decades, tends to rise. And for a man who has owned his home for 15 or 20 years, the structure is likely the largest single asset in his life. It represents years of discipline. It represents the tangible proof that I handle it works. But the house is also concentration. Financial advisors talk about diversification spreading risk across different assets so that a single failure doesn't take down the whole system. Your house violates that principle. It holds your equity, your liability, your maintenance uncertainty, and your physical safety in one address. If the market drops, your equity drops. If the roof fails, your cash flow takes the hit. If the neighborhood changes, your asset changes with it. And there is no partner splitting that exposure. No second income softening the impact of a $10,000 surprise. The home is both your greatest proof of stability and your single largest unhedged position. And most men in this situation never frame it that way because the house feels safe. It is safe until the load event arrives. Now add the body. The residence is indifferent to age. It was indifferent when you were 35 and could spend a Saturday on a ladder cleaning leaves out of the gutters without thinking about it. It is equally indifferent now. The gutters are the same height. The crawl space is the same width. The circuit breaker is in the same awkward corner of the basement. But you are not the same, not dramatically different, not incapacitated, but different. A ladder at 58 carries a different risk profile than a ladder at 35. Not because you can't climb it, you can, but because a fall at 35 is a bruise and a story. A fall at 58 is a fracture and a system interruption. The house doesn't adjust for that. It doesn't lower the gutters. It doesn't widen the crawl space. It doesn't move the shutoff valve to a more accessible location. This property is a long-term contract, and the body it contracted with has a shorter warranty than the structure itself. Here's the tension that builds quietly inside this arrangement. The repair from the opening, the one under the sink, it needs a contractor. The contractor is available Tuesday and Thursday mornings. You work Tuesday and Thursday mornings. In a two-person household, this is a minor scheduling puzzle. One person stays home, the other goes to work. Solved in a text message. In your household, this is a binary choice. Take the morning off or delay the repair. And delaying the repair means the water sits. The wood swells further. The mold risk increases. The cost goes up, so you take the morning off. You absorb the disruption, because you are the only one who can. This is the moment the system reveals itself, not in a crisis, not in a catastrophe, in a Tuesday morning scheduling conflict that has no clean solution because the architecture assumes a second adult. And somewhere in that moment, a quiet shift happens. I'm independent stops sounding like freedom. It starts sounding like a description of a system with no backup. I'm independent becomes I'm the only redundancy. That's not a failure. It's not a flaw. It's a structural fact. And structural facts don't care about your feelings about them. They operate whether you name them or not. So let's name it. The house expects a second operator, not emotionally, not romantically, operationally. It was designed for a household, and a household, in the way American residential infrastructure evolved, means more than one adult. The tax code assumes it. The insurance forms assume it. The contractor's scheduling grid assumes it. The emergency contact line on the plumber's intake form assumes it. You are operating a two-person system with one person. And you have been doing it so well, for so long, that you stopped noticing the gap. The gap didn't disappear. You just filled it. Every time. With your time, your energy, your flexibility, your willingness to absorb friction without complaint. Surface stability is often a single operator system that has not yet met a high-load event. That line is worth sitting with, not because it predicts disaster, not because something bad is coming, but because it describes, accurately, the physics of how your life is built. One operator, no redundancy. Stable until the load exceeds what one person can carry in one body on one calendar with one income and one house. The next question is not whether that load event will come. The question is what the system looks like when it does. The water damage behind the cabinet panel is worse than you thought. You knew it would be. That's the thing about water. It doesn't stay where you find it. It travels. It follows gravity, and then it follows capillary action, and then it sits in places you can't see until the material changes texture or color or smell. The contractor opens the wall, not the whole wall, just enough to look. And what he finds is what you suspected, but didn't want to confirm. The leak has been slow for a while. Weeks, maybe longer. The drywall behind the sink is soft. There's discoloration running down toward the subfloor. He says the word mold in that careful way contractors use when they want you to know it's serious, but they don't want to be the one who officially diagnoses it. Now the chain extends. Mold testing. That's a different company. The contractor doesn't do mold testing because of liability. So you call a mold inspection service. They can come Friday. You're available Friday afternoon, but they only do mornings. You shift a meeting. You make it work. They test. Results take 3 to 5 business days. While you wait for the results, the insurance question arises. Does your homeowner's policy cover water damage from a slow leak? The answer depends on the policy, the cause, the duration, and whether the insurer considers it sudden or gradual. You call your agent. The agent asks questions you don't have full answers to yet because the mold report isn't back. So you wait. And while you wait, the damaged section of wall stays open, covered with plastic sheeting the contractor tacked up before he left. The property now has a wound, visible, unresolved, and every time you walk into the kitchen, you see it. This is not a crisis. Let's be clear about that. No one is in danger. The house is standing. The water is shut off to that line. You're using the bathroom sink for the dishes, which is inconvenient but manageable. This is not the kind of event that makes the news or requires emergency services. But it is the kind of event that reveals how the arrangement actually works under load. And what it reveals is this: when there is no second operator, every decision cues behind the same person. The mold company needs a call back to schedule. The insurance agent needs documentation you haven't assembled yet. The contractor needs an answer on scope before he can book the next available slot, which is already 2 weeks out. And your employer needs you in a meeting Thursday that you already moved once this week. None of these tasks are individually difficult. Any one of them takes 15 minutes. But they don't arrive individually. They arrive simultaneously. And they all route through the same node. You. In systems language, this is called single node governance. Every approval, every authorization, every scheduling decision passes through one point. When that point is available and functioning well, the system moves. When that point is occupied, at work, asleep, handling another task, or simply too tired to make one more phone call, the system stalls. And stalled calls in a house with water damage are not neutral. They compound. The longer the wall stays open, the higher the mold risk. The longer you wait on insurance, the less leverage you have on the claim. The longer the contractor waits for scope approval, the further out his calendar pushes. Time pressure plus single node governance equals decision fatigue. And decision fatigue doesn't announce itself. It doesn't feel like exhaustion. It feels like mild irritation that you can't quite locate. It feels like putting the phone down after the third call and staring at the wall for a moment before picking it up again. It feels like eating cereal for dinner, not because you can't cook, but because the idea of making one more decision, even a small one, like what to eat, is more than this setup wants to process. This is the part that doesn't get talked about. Not the cost of the repair, not the inconvenience. The cognitive load of being the only person who can authorize anything. Let's look at what cost sharing actually means in practice, because people usually reduce it to money. It must be nice to split the bills. That's the version you hear. And yes, splitting a $5,000 repair into two $2,500 hits is easier on a bank account. That's arithmetic. It's obvious. It's also not the main thing. The main thing is shared tolerance for risk. In a two-person household, one person can say, "I think we should go with the cheaper contractor," and the other can say, "I think the more expensive one is more reliable." That's a negotiation. It produces a judgment that has been stress-tested by two different risk profiles. The outcome is usually better than either person would have reached alone, not because two people are smarter, but because the decision has been examined from more than one angle. In a one-person household, every risk assessment is internal. You argue with yourself. You weigh both sides. And then you decide. And the decision may be excellent. It probably is. You've been making decisions alone for decades, and most of them have landed well. But the process costs more energy when it's entirely internal. There's no external check. No one to say, "That sounds right," or "Wait, what about this?" The cognitive work of validation falls on the same person who did the cognitive work of analysis. There's also no shared oversight to catch predatory pricing or sloppy work. You're the client and the quality inspector. When the contractor finishes, you check the work. But you check it against your own knowledge, which may or may not include the specific trade skill involved. In a two-person household, there's at least a chance that one person knows plumbing and the other knows insurance. Or one person is better at confrontation and the other is better at documentation. Skills distribute across people. In a one-operator system, the skills either exist in you or they don't, and the ones that don't exist become vulnerabilities you manage through research, guesswork, or trust. Trust in a contractor when you have no one to consult is a different experience than trust in a contractor when you've talked it over with someone. The first kind of trust is isolated. It carries the full weight of the outcome. If the contractor does poor work, the mistake is yours, not because you did the work, but because you chose the person, you approved the scope, you signed the check. Every delegation loops back to you. Now let's sharpen the identity layer, because this is where it cuts closer. High-functioning men who have lived alone for a long time often develop a specific relationship with difficulty. The relationship goes like this. If something is hard, that's proof I'm the right person to be handling it. Friction becomes validation. The harder the task, the more it confirms the identity of competence. This works. It works beautifully at 35. At 35, the body cooperates. The energy is there. The mental sharpness is there. The willingness to grind through a problem on a Saturday afternoon reading a manual, watching a repair video, driving to the hardware store twice because the first part was wrong, that willingness is almost enjoyable. It feels like self-reliance in action. It feels like the purest form of independence. At 55, the willingness is still there, but the body has opinions now. The knees have opinions about kneeling under a sink for 40 minutes. The back has opinions about carrying a sheet of plywood from the truck to the building. The eyes have opinions about reading small print on an insurance form at 10 at night. The identity doesn't adjust. The identity still says, if it's hard, I'm supposed to carry it. But the cost of carrying it has increased, not dramatically, not disabling, just measurably. The recovery time after a physical task is longer. The patience for a phone tree is shorter. The ability to hold 6 open tasks in working memory without writing them down is less reliable than it was a decade ago. And here's the part that matters. The man who built his identity on carrying hard things is the last person who will admit the carrying has gotten heavier. Because admitting that feels like the beginning of a concession he's not willing to make. It feels like the first crack in a wall he's maintained his entire adult life, the wall that says, I don't need the system to accommodate me. I accommodate the system. That identity worked. It worked for 25 years. But identity that was formed under one set of physical conditions doesn't automatically update when the conditions change. It persists. And its persistence is both a strength because it keeps you moving and a quiet liability because it prevents you from noticing when the cost of movement has shifted. Let's go back to the house. Because the house doesn't care about identity. The repair task list is also a body task list. This is easy to overlook because we categorize tasks by their outcome. Fix the sink, replace the drywall, paint the wall, rather than by their physical requirements. But every task on that list has a body cost. Kneeling under the cabinet to assess the damage, lifting debris into bags, climbing a step stool to check if the leak traveled up into the ceiling, driving to the supply store, loading materials, carrying them in, waiting on site for the inspector, which means standing or sitting in a house with no functioning kitchen sink for 4 hours on a weekday morning. At 35, these are inconveniences. At 55, they are energy expenditures that compete with everything else the body needs to do that. Week, work, exercise, sleep, the basic maintenance of a body that is, itself, a system with increasing maintenance requirements. The question becomes logistical, not emotional. Logistical. A significant portion of this system, the property, the physical infrastructure of your life, depends on your physical availability. And what happens when that availability is reduced? Not eliminated, just reduced. A bad back for a week. A flu that lasts 10 days. A minor surgery that puts you on restricted movement for a month. The dwelling doesn't pause. The repair timeline doesn't pause. The mold doesn't pause. The contractor's schedule doesn't adjust because your body needs a week off. The architecture requires continuity, and continuity requires a body that can show up not just financially, not just mentally, but physically. This is concentration risk in a form that financial planners never mention. They talk about diversifying your portfolio. They don't talk about diversifying your physical dependency. But the house concentrates your physical risk the same way it concentrates your financial risk. One address, one body. One person who has to be present, capable, and making choices. A moment arrives during the repair process that seems minor. The contractor is filling out a liability form. Standard paperwork. And he asks, in that flat, procedural tone that tradespeople use when they're just working down a list, is anyone else on the deed? He doesn't mean anything by it. He's asking because the form has a line for co-owners, and he needs to know whether someone else might have authority over the scope of work. It's a legal question, a bureaucratic question, but the question lands. No one else is on the deed. There is no co-owner. There is no secondary contact with legal authority over the property. If you were in the hospital tomorrow, the contractor would have no one to call. The project would stall. The wall would stay open. The mold would grow. And the system would wait because the only node with authorization power would be unavailable. This is not a feeling. This is a fact about how the property is governed. And the fact exposes something that the daily routine keeps hidden. Your house runs on a single authorization channel. One signature, one voice, one decision maker. Every approval, from the plumber to the insurance company to the city permit office, routes through you. There is no delegation path. There is no backup signer. There is no one who can say, "Yes, proceed," if you are unable to say it yourself. Most days, that doesn't matter. Most days, the system runs fine on one channel. Decisions are small. Approvals are routine. The single authorization works because the load is normal. The repair is the first time in a while that the load has been abnormal, not catastrophic, just abnormal. And under abnormal load, the single-channel architecture becomes visible. What you're looking at now is not the pipe. It's not the wall. It's not the mold report you're waiting on. You're looking at the absence of redundancy. The repair wasn't the event. The repair was the audit. And the audit found what audits always find in sole operator systems. Everything works until it needs to work without you. That's the first loop closed. The question from the opening, if a house can require 2 adults without saying so, what else does the same, has its first answer. The house requires a second operator, not for companionship, not for comfort, but for continuity, for authorization, for the ability to keep decisions moving when the primary operator is occupied, depleted, or unavailable. When a system has no co-operator, every inconvenience becomes governance. That contractor's form, sitting on your kitchen counter with one blank line where a co-owner's name would go, is the clearest picture of how the apparatus actually runs. Not broken, not failing, just exposed, carrying everything it was designed to carry, plus the weight of everything it assumed someone else would share. The wall is still open. The plastic sheeting moves slightly when the heat kicks on. The bucket is dry now because the water is off. And the structure waits for its single operator to make the next decision. There are more systems like this in your life. The house was just the one that made it visible first. Let's leave the home for a while. Not because it's resolved, it isn't. The mold report is pending. The contractor is waiting. The insurance company has your claim in a queue somewhere. But the house has done its job as a diagnostic tool. It showed you what a single operator system looks like under moderate stress. Now let's look at the other systems. Because the residence is not the only structure in your life that was quietly designed for 2. Start with healthcare, not the dramatic version, not the emergency room, not the diagnosis, not the surgery. Start with the ordinary version, the annual physical, the colonoscopy you've been putting off, the dermatologist appointment for that spot on your back that's probably nothing but has been there long enough to warrant a look. In a 2-person household, healthcare has a secondary operator. Someone notices that you've been putting off the appointment. Someone says, "Did you reschedule that?" Someone drives you to the procedure that requires sedation, waits in the lobby, drives you home, and makes sure you don't eat anything you shouldn't for the next 12 hours. Someone reads the aftercare instructions when you're too groggy to focus. In your system, all of that is self-managed. You schedule the appointment. You remember to fast. You arrange your own transportation, which for a sedation procedure means either asking someone a task that carries social weight you'd rather not deal with, or using a car service, which means a stranger drives you home while you're half conscious. You read your own aftercare instructions. You monitor your own recovery. The medical system, like the house, assumes a household. Discharge instructions say things like, have someone check on you every few hours, and do not operate heavy machinery for 24 hours, and contact your physician if symptoms worsen. These instructions are written for a patient who has a someone, a person in the next room, a person who will notice if something seems off. You are the patient and the someone, and you have been managing that dual role so efficiently that it no longer registers as unusual. You get the sedation. You take the car home. You set an alarm to check on yourself. You follow the instructions. You're fine. You've always been fine. But fine is not the same as supported. Fine means nothing went wrong. Supported means the system had a backup in case something did. This distinction matters because healthcare after 50 is not the same as healthcare at 30. The frequency increases. The screenings multiply. The baseline shifts from confirm everything is normal to check whether anything has changed. And each of those interactions carries the same logistical chain as this property repair: scheduling, transportation, presence, decision-making, follow-up. Each one roots through you. A man with a partner doesn't think about who will drive him to the endoscopy. It's handled. A man without a partner thinks about it, solves it, and then files the solution away, undermanaged. But the cognitive cost of that management accumulates. Not per event, over years. Over dozens of appointments, procedures, follow-ups, pharmacy runs, insurance disputes, and the slow background work of maintaining a body that requires increasing professional attention. And here's the layer beneath the logistics. There is a particular kind of medical encounter that happens after 50. The doctor says something, a lab result, a scan finding, a recommendation for further testing, and there's a moment between hearing it and understanding it. In that moment, you are alone with the information. Not alone in the existential sense, alone in the operational sense. There is no one in the waiting room to process it with. No one in the car on the drive home to absorb the first wave of whatever the information produces: concern, confusion, irritation, recalculation. You process it yourself. You always have. You sit with the information. You research it that night. You decide how seriously to take it. You make the follow-up appointment, or you don't. The determination tree is entirely internal. And the internal decision tree works well. You're rational. You're informed. You've been managing your own health for decades. But the internal decision tree has one structural weakness. It has no external audit. No one says, "That doesn't sound right, get a second opinion." No one says, "You've been ignoring that for 3 months." No one notices the pattern that you can't see because you're inside it. A man living alone after 50 is his own medical advocate, his own patient liaison, his own second opinion, and the quality of that advocacy depends entirely on his willingness to take himself as seriously as he would take someone he cared about, which, if you've spent your adult life prioritizing function over attention, is not as automatic as it sounds. Let's move to another system. Work. Not the content of work. Not what you do. the structural role that work plays in the architecture of a single life. For a man in a two-person household, work is one identity among several. He is an employee or a business owner, and he is a partner, and perhaps a father, and a neighbor, and a member of a social network that extends through his partner's connections. Work is significant, but it shares identity space with other roles. For a never-married man past 50, work often occupies a larger portion of the identity structure. Not because he's a workaholic, not because he doesn't have other interests, but because work is the role that provides the most consistent external feedback. It's the place where competence is visible, where contributions are acknowledged, where the daily rhythm has a social component that the rest of life may not. The house doesn't thank you for maintaining it. The body doesn't acknowledge the effort of keeping it healthy. The financial system doesn't celebrate the discipline of consistent saving. But work gives you meetings, projects, outcomes, evaluations, maybe a team that relies on you. Work gives you the thing that a single life can quietly erode, evidence that you matter to a system larger than yourself. This is not a criticism. It's an observation about structural incentive. When work is the primary source of external identity validation, it becomes load-bearing in a way that goes beyond income. It carries your social identity, your daily structure, your sense of relevance, and a significant portion of your human interaction. That's a lot of weight on one pillar. And here's why it matters structurally. Pillars that carry too much weight are the ones that cause the most damage when they shift. Career transitions after 50 are common. Companies restructure. Industries change. Roles evolve in ways that no longer match the skills you built your reputation on. Early retirement gets floated, sometimes as an opportunity, sometimes as a suggestion with pressure behind it. Or the transition is internal. The work stops engaging you. The problems repeat. The politics increase. The sense of forward motion fades. In a two-person household, a career shift is destabilizing but not identity-threatening, because identity is distributed across multiple roles. The man who loses his job is still a husband, still a father, still a person whose presence in the home has structural meaning. For a man whose identity is concentrated in work, a career shift doesn't just change the income. It changes the architecture. The daily structure disappears. The social interaction drops. The external feedback loop goes quiet. And the question that was always there, buried under productive busyness, surfaces. What am I when I'm not working? That question hits differently when there's no one else in the house to absorb it. No one to say, through their continued presence, you are still this. You are still here. Your role in this household hasn't changed. The house is empty the same way it was before. But now the hours are too. This is not about loneliness. Let's be precise about that. Loneliness is an emotional state, and it may or may not apply. Many men in this situation don't feel lonely. They feel unstructured. They feel the absence of a framework, not the absence of a person. The framework was work. And without it, the days require something they didn't require before: self-generated purpose. Self-generated purpose sounds like a philosophy seminar, but it's actually a logistics problem. Tuesday needs a plan. Not this Tuesday, you can fill this Tuesday. What do you do on the 47th Tuesday after the job ends? No structure automatically replaces the one that work provided. Something still needs to get you dressed, out of the building, engaged with something that responds to your effort. A man with a partner has a built-in answer. Even if it's imperfect, the relationship generates tasks, rhythms, obligations, and interactions. Groceries need buying. Plans need making. Conversations happen whether you initiate them or not. The household itself is a small organization that requires participation. A man alone has to build that structure from raw materials. And building structure from raw materials requires a kind of effort that is fundamentally different from maintaining an existing one. It requires initiative when the motivation is low. It requires social outreach when the habit isn't there. It requires vulnerability, showing up somewhere new, being the person who doesn't know anyone, starting from zero in a context where starting over feels like something that should have happened 20 years ago. Most men in this position don't build that structure proactively. They wait for the shift to happen, the retirement, the layoff, the career change, and then they encounter the vacuum. And the vacuum is disorienting not because it's dramatic, but because it's quiet. The phone stops ringing as much. The email slows down. The calendar opens up in a way that should feel like freedom, but instead feels like a question with no clear answer. Let's talk about the social system, because this is where the exposure becomes most structurally significant, and also where it is least visible. Social networks for men tend to narrow after 50. This is well documented. It's not a mystery, and it's not unique to single men. Married men experience it too. But the narrowing has different consequences depending on whether you have a domestic anchor. A married man whose social circle shrinks still has daily social contact. He has someone to eat with, talk with, argue with, plan with. The social network outside the home can atrophy without immediately threatening his sense of connection. It's not healthy long term, but it's buffered. A never married man whose social circle shrinks is losing primary connections, not secondary ones. Each friendship that fades, each colleague who moves away, each social context that dissolves, these aren't peripheral losses. They're structural losses because there is no domestic core to fall back on. The social network isn't supplementary. It's the whole system. And men in this situation often don't notice the narrowing until they need the network and find it thinner than expected. The need might be practical. You need someone to pick you up from a medical procedure. It might be logistical. You need someone to check on the house while you travel. It might be informational. You need someone who's been through a similar experience, a property dispute, a health scare, a career shift, and can offer a perspective you don't have. The request doesn't come naturally. That's the structural problem. A man who has spent decades operating independently has often lost the vocabulary of specific asking. He can offer help fluently. He can manage projects, solve problems, provide advice. But making a specific bounded request that acknowledges a gap in his own capacity, that language has atrophied. Not because he's proud, because he's out of practice. A friend says, "Let me know if you need anything," And you nod, and you mean the nod sincerely. But you have no idea what to ask for. Not because the needs don't exist, because the needs have never been translated into requests. They've always been absorbed internally, converted into action items, handled, so the offer passes. The friend meant it, you appreciated it, and the gap remains because the bridge between "I could use help" and "here is what I specifically need" was never built. Or it was built once, long ago, and has since been dismantled by years of self-sufficient operation. This is not a psychological deficiency. It's an atrophied skill. The skill of asking is like any other. It requires practice, context, and a system that rewards its use. A man who has never been in a household where asking was routine, where "can you handle this while I handle that?" was a daily negotiation, hasn't had the practice. The skill didn't decay from disuse. It was never fully developed in this context. And here's the structural consequence. A man who can't ask can't delegate. And a man who can't delegate is a man who runs every system in his life through a single node, not by choice, not by philosophy, by architecture, the house, the healthcare, the career identity, the social network, the daily structure. Each of these systems has the same design characteristic. One person, no redundancy, no delegation path. And each of them works. That's the important part. They work. The bills get paid. The appointments happen. The house is maintained. The career functions. The social interactions, however infrequent, are genuine when they occur. From the outside, the system is stable. But stability and resilience are not the same thing. Stability means the framework works under current conditions. Resilience means the system can absorb a disruption and continue functioning. A system that has been stable for 20 years can fail in a week if the disruption exceeds the capacity of its single operator. And the disruptions that come after 50 are not the same as the disruptions that came at 35. They're slower, longer, more compound. A health issue at 35 is an event. It happens. You recover. You move on. A health issue at 55 can be a process. It develops. It requires management. It changes the operating parameters of the body for months or years. A job loss at 35 is a setback. You regroup, you apply, you find the next thing. A job loss at 55 is a structural question. Do I re-enter the same field? Do I shift? Do I have the runway to wait? What happens to the identity that was built on this work? The disruptions get slower, but the system's capacity to absorb them doesn't increase. If anything, it decreases because the body has less reserve. The financial timeline is shorter, and the social network that might have helped is thinner than it used to be. Privacy has been a design principle in this life. Not secrecy privacy. There's a difference. Secrecy hides something shameful. Privacy protects something valuable. And for many men in this position, privacy is what allows the operating structure to function with dignity. You don't broadcast your medical results. You don't discuss your finances with friends. You don't narrate your struggles to colleagues. You handle things privately because privacy is how you maintain the boundary between who you are and what you're dealing with. But privacy, as a design principle, has a cost. It optimizes for discretion. It does not optimize for resilience. A system designed for maximum privacy is a system designed for minimum information sharing. And minimum information sharing means that when a disruption comes, no one around you has the context to help, even if they want to. They don't know about the leak. They don't know about the lab result. They don't know about the career uncertainty. They don't know because you never told them. And you never told them because the system wasn't designed for that kind of information flow. Privacy becomes a constraint that looks like a preference. From the inside, it feels like autonomy. From the outside, it might even look like strength. But from an engineering standpoint, it's a single operator system with no monitoring, no alerts, and no external awareness of its internal state. The dwelling is an external skeleton. The body is the internal one. Both age. Both require maintenance that increases over time. Both experience wear that is cumulative, not linear. And both can reach a point where the maintenance exceeds the operator's capacity, not all at once, but gradually, in ways that are easy to normalize, because each individual adjustment is small. One more thing to hold before we move forward. The house has a warranty claim process. When the roof fails, there's an insurance policy. When the appliance breaks, there's a manufacturer's guarantee. When the contractor's work fails, there's a liability agreement. These systems are imperfect, but they exist. There is a path to recourse. The body does not have this. There is no warranty. There is health insurance, which covers treatment, but there is no structural guarantee of continuity. No one is contractually obligated to make sure your body keeps functioning at the level your life requires. The medical system treats problems. It does not maintain systems. That's your job. And in a lone operator household, that job, like every other job, falls on one person. The external skeleton and the internal one are both aging. The structure and the body are both under load. And both are governed by the same single operator, who has been so competent for so long that the question of what happens when competence isn't enough has never needed answering. It needs answering now, not urgently, not dramatically, but structurally. Because the repair under the sink wasn't just a pipe. It was the first visible crack in a system that has been running on one person's capacity for decades. And the crack didn't appear because the system was poorly built. It appeared because all systems, no matter how well built, eventually encounter a load that tests their design limits. Yours has been tested, lightly, by a pipe and some water damage and a contractor's form with a blank line. The next test might be light too, or it might not. The point isn't to predict the severity. The point is to notice the architecture clearly, without sentiment, without alarm, and ask whether the architecture is designed to handle what's coming. Not what might be coming. What is coming? Because aging isn't a possibility. It's a schedule. The mold report comes back. It's not catastrophic. Elevated levels in one area behind the sink wall, within a range that requires remediation, but not evacuation. The testing company sends a PDF with results, recommendations, and a list of certified remediation contractors. You add it to the folder you've been building estimates. Photos, insurance correspondence, the original plumber's invoice. A folder is getting thick, not metaphorically. You've been printing things because you don't trust yourself to keep track of 7 open threads across email, voicemail, and text. Paper on the kitchen table. A legal pad with dates and names and phone numbers. The machinery you've built to manage this one repair looks from above like a small project office. Because that's what it is. And now the repair forces something you weren't expecting. Secondary paperwork. Not the repair paperwork. You've handled that. The paperwork that the repair exposed because it made you open drawers and files you haven't touched in a while. The homeowner's insurance policy. You pulled it to check the water damage coverage. But while you had it open, you noticed the emergency contact field. It lists a name. A friend from 8 years ago. Someone you still know, but haven't spoken to in over a year. If the insurance company called that number in an emergency, the person on the other end might not pick up. And if they did, they wouldn't know where your shutoff valves are, where your breaker box is, or what contractor you've been working with. The emergency contact is a formality you filled in because the form required it. It does not represent an actual emergency plan. It represents a name in a box. You set that aside and keep going. The contractor's liability form asks for a secondary contact in case the homeowner is unreachable during the project. You leave it blank, not because you're making a statement, because there's no one to put there who would know what decisions to make. Then the insurance adjuster asks, during a phone call about the claim, whether you have a power of attorney on file for the property. You don't. You've never needed one. The question is routine for the adjuster. He asks everyone. But it opens a door you haven't walked through. Power of attorney. The legal document that allows someone else to make authorizations on your behalf if you're unable to. For property, for finances, for medical decisions. It's the formalization of delegation, and you don't have one. Not because you oppose it, because the question has never been forced into the foreground by anything urgent enough to require action. These are not traumatic realizations. They're procedural, forms with blank lines, documents that don't exist, contact fields with outdated names. Each one, individually, is a minor administrative gap. Together, they form a picture. The picture is this: if you were unavailable tomorrow, not dead, not permanently incapacitated, just unavailable for 2 weeks due to illness, injury, or anything that takes you out of the decision seat, the systems that run your life would stall. Not collapse, stall. The contractor would wait. The insurance claim would freeze. The mail would pile up. The bills on autopay would continue, but anything requiring a judgment call would queue behind a locked door. This is what procedural exposure looks like, not a crisis. An absence of transfer protocols. Let's run a few scenarios, not worst cases. Controlled ones, realistic ones. The kind of thing that happens to men in their 50s without warning and without drama. Scenario 1. You get the flu, not a mild cold. A real flu. Fever, fatigue, 10 days of diminished capacity. During those 10 days, The contractor is scheduled to begin remediation. He needs access to the house. He needs someone present for the first day to walk through the scope. He needs a decision about whether to replace the subfloor section or treat it. These resolutions require your physical presence and your cognitive engagement. You have neither. You're in bed with 102 fever, and the most complex task you can manage is refilling a glass of water. The project stalls. The contractor moves to another job. His next opening is 3 weeks later. The mold sits. The wall stays open. The cost increases not because of the flu, but because the system has no mechanism for continuity when the single operator is down. Scenario 2. You travel unexpectedly. A family obligation, a work assignment, something that pulls you out of state for a week. Before you leave, the home needs to be secured, but the remediation is mid-process. Half the wall is open. The dehumidifier is running. Someone needs to check it daily. There is no someone. You either delay the trip, delay the remediation, or ask a favor from a person who doesn't have context on the project and would need a full briefing just to check whether a machine is still running. Each option has a cost. Each cost falls on you. There is no distribution mechanism. Scenario 3. A minor fall. Not catastrophic. You miss a step coming down the basement stairs. Twisted ankle. Maybe a hairline fracture. Suddenly, stairs are difficult for 3 weeks. The house has 2 floors. The laundry is in the basement. The bedroom is upstairs. The kitchen is on the main floor. The house, which was designed for a mobile adult, becomes an obstacle course for a temporarily limited one. You manage. You always manage. You bring the laundry basket down 1 step at a time, sitting. You sleep on the couch for a few nights until the stairs feel safer. You order groceries delivered instead of driving to the store. Each adaptation is small. Each one is solved. But each one is solved by the same person who is injured, which means every solution costs more than it would in a system with a second operator. None of these scenarios are emergencies. That's the point. They are ordinary disruptions. The kind that happen to everyone. Flu, travel, a minor injury. In a 2-person household, each of these is absorbed by the system with minimal structural impact. One person covers for the other. Decisions continue. The project moves forward. Life adjusts and proceeds. In a solo operator system, each of these ordinary disruptions becomes a system-level event. Not because the disruption is severe, but because the design has no surge capacity. There is no reserve operator. There is no one who can step in with authority and context and make the next decision. The word for this, in operational terms, is brittleness. A brittle system is one that performs well under normal conditions, but has limited capacity to absorb unexpected variation. It doesn't fail often, but when it does, it fails sharply, because there are no buffers. Your life is not brittle in the way that word usually implies. You've built real stability, real competence, real durability. But the system's durability depends on one variable remaining constant. You, your health, your presence, your cognitive availability, your physical capacity. If that variable holds, the system runs indefinitely. If it dips even temporarily, even modestly, the effects cascade. Not dramatically, procedurally. One stalled decision leads to another, which leads to a delayed timeline, which leads to increased cost, which leads to increased stress, which feeds back into reduced capacity. That's a feedback loop. And feedback loops in systems without buffers can accelerate before anyone notices. Now let's look at what sits beneath the procedural layer. Because the forms and the scenarios are the visible part, underneath them is something structural about identity. The provider role for a man living alone has a specific shape. In a household with others, the provider has a complementary role, someone who receives. The dynamic creates a circuit. Energy flows out as provision and returns as acknowledgement, comfort, shared benefit, or simply the visible evidence that the provision matters. In a single-person household, the provider role has no complement. You provide for yourself. You maintain for yourself. You repair, fund, schedule, authorize, execute, and follow up for yourself. The circuit is closed. The energy flows out and returns to the same source. It's efficient. But efficiency and sustainability are not identical. A provider without a household, without anyone to provide for, still carries the behavioral architecture of provision, the discipline, the vigilance, the orientation toward maintenance and stability, the refusal to let things slide. These behaviors persist because they are wired into the identity, not because they are rewarded by a system. And the persistence of those behaviors creates a particular kind of invisible exhaustion. Not burnout implies a recognizable breaking point. This is quieter. It's the fatigue of running a full provider operation with no one to share the cognitive weight. No one to say, "I've got this one." No one to take the night shift on a call that can wait until morning. The exhaustion doesn't register as exhaustion because it has become the baseline. You've been tired in this specific way for so long that it feels like normal operating temperature. You're not depleted. You're just never fully at rest. There's always a thread running. The insurance claim, the contractor's timeline, the next appointment, the quarterly tax estimate, the thing you noticed on the roof last weekend that you haven't dealt with yet. That thread is the sound of a single operator managing every system simultaneously. And the operator has gotten so good at managing the threads that he's forgotten that most operating systems are designed to distribute threads across multiple processors. Here's where the identity layer sharpens to its finest edge. A man who has built a life on not needing anyone arrives, somewhere past 50, at an intersection he didn't see coming. Not a crisis, an intersection. Two paths that have been running parallel suddenly converge. Path 1, the identity that says, "I handle everything and I do it well, and that is who I am." Path 2, the operational reality that says, "The infrastructure you're operating is reaching the limits of what one person can sustain without structural support." These two paths are not in conflict yet. You're still handling everything. The system still works. But the margin has narrowed. The space between "I've got this" and "this is more than one person should be carrying" has gotten smaller. Not because you've gotten weaker, because the load has gotten heavier. The body's maintenance costs have increased. The residence's demands haven't decreased. The healthcare system requires more of your time. The social network has thinned. The career identity may be shifting. Each of these changes is small. None of them alone would constitute a problem, but they're additive. And they're additive in a system that has no way to offload the accumulation. The man at this intersection, and if you're listening to this, you may be at this intersection or approaching it, faces a structural question that masquerades as a personal one. The personal version sounds like, am I okay? Am I handling this? Am I falling behind? Those questions lead to self-assessment, which leads to the conclusion that yes, you're fine, because by any reasonable standard, you are fine. The structural version sounds different. Is the architecture of my life designed to sustain the load it will carry over the next 10 to 20 years? That question doesn't ask about your feelings. It doesn't ask about your worth. It doesn't ask whether you've done a good job. It asks about engineering. It asks whether the system, the actual operational system of your daily life, has the structural capacity to handle what's coming without depending entirely on one variable remaining constant. And the honest answer for most men in this position is the architecture has never been tested at full load. It's performed well under normal conditions. It's even handled some moderate stress, but it has not been subjected to the compound disruptions that become more likely with each passing year: simultaneous health issue and financial, stress and career transition, and property failure and social network thinning. That compound event may never arrive in full force. Many men live through their 60s and 70s without encountering the worst-case scenario. But the architecture doesn't know that. The architecture only knows what it's designed to handle. And right now, it's designed to handle one thing at a time, processed by one person with no delegation path. The friend's offer comes back here. Let me know if you need anything. You heard it. You appreciated it. And you let it pass because you didn't have a specific request. But look at what that moment actually reveals. It's not about pride. It's not about stubbornness. It's about the absence of a vocabulary. You've been handling things so long that the language of specific asking has atrophied. You can describe a problem fluently. You can analyze a situation with precision. You can offer help to others with detailed, actionable suggestions. But the reverse translating your own need into a specific bounded request feels foreign. Not difficult in the way that emotional vulnerability is difficult. Foreign in the way that speaking a language you haven't used in decades is foreign. The grammar is vague. The words don't come easily. The sentences feel awkward before they're fully formed. So you default to the familiar response. I'm good, thanks. And the moment passes. And the structure continues running on one operator, not because help was unavailable, because the interface between the system and external support was never built. That interface, the ability to convert an internal need into an external request, is not a personality trait. It's a skill, a functional skill like budgeting or scheduling or managing a contractor. It can be developed. It can be practiced. but it requires something the current system is not designed to produce: a specific acknowledgement that the system has gaps. Not failures, gaps, places where the architecture assumes a capacity that may not always be available, places where a second authorization, a second set of eyes, a second calendar would change the risk profile from brittle to resilient. Dignity is not threatened by this acknowledgement. That's the part that matters most, and it's the part that feels least intuitive, because the identity says that acknowledging a gap is the same as admitting a weakness. And weakness, in the framework you've built your life on, is the one thing you cannot afford. But a gap is not a weakness. A gap is a design feature that hasn't been addressed. The house has a gap where a co-signer should be. The healthcare system has a gap where a medical advocate should be. The social network has a gap where a specific request vocabulary should be. The career identity has a gap where a secondary purpose structure should be. These gaps don't mean the arrangement is broken. They mean the system was designed under one set of assumptions: maximum autonomy, single operator efficiency, privacy as a core principle, and those assumptions, while functional, have produced an architecture with known vulnerabilities. The strongest structures in the world are the ones whose designers knew where the stress points were, not the ones with no stress points. Those don't exist. The ones where the engineers identified the vulnerable joints, the load-bearing connections, the single points of failure, and designed around them. Not by eliminating them, by acknowledging them and building transfer paths. A life that depends only on you is stable. That's true. You've proven it over decades. But stable and resilient are different engineering standards. Stable means it holds under current load. Resilient means it holds when the load changes. And the load is going to change. Not because something is wrong, because that's what load does. It changes. Bodies age. Markets shift. Careers evolve. Houses deteriorate. Social networks transform. Each of these changes is normal, expected, unremarkable, but each one adds weight to a system that has no mechanism for redistribution. The question is not whether you can handle it. You can. You have. You will. The question is whether the system you've built can handle it without you being at full capacity every single day. A life that depends only on you is stable until it requires anyone else to act. That line from earlier. It hasn't changed, but maybe now it has a different weight. Not heavier, clearer. The clarity of seeing the full architecture, not just the visible surface, but the load paths, the stress points, the places where this setup assumes a constant that isn't guaranteed. A contractor's form is still on the kitchen table. The blank line where a co-owner's name would go is still blank. But the blank isn't invisible anymore. You can see it. And seeing it clearly, without flinching, without dramatizing, without turning it into a crisis, that's the first structural act. Not fixing, seeing. What happens next isn't about repair. It's about design. There's a specific moment in a long project, any long project, not just a house repair, where the problem shifts. The early phase is reactive. Something broke. You respond. You diagnose. You manage. The middle phase is exposure. You see what the break revealed about the system underneath. The late phase is different. The late phase is where you stop responding to the problem and start looking at the design that produced it. That's where we are now, not in the leak, not in the mold, not in the contractor's schedule or the insurance adjuster's questions. We're in the architecture, the design of a life that has been running on a one man for decades, running well, and is now being examined not because it failed, but because examination is overdue. Let's be clear about what this examination is not. It is not self-improvement. Self-improvement assumes a deficiency. Something is wrong with you, and you need to become a better version. That framework doesn't apply here. Nothing is wrong with you. The system you built works. It has worked for a long time. The question is not how to fix yourself. The question is how to redesign the architecture so that it doesn't require you to be flawless in order to function. That distinction matters. Because the moment this starts to sound like a self-help prescription, you'll stop listening. And you should stop listening because that's not what this is. This is systems architecture applied to a life. The same way an engineer looks at a bridge and asks, what happens when one cable fails? Not because the cable is bad, but because cables fail. All of them. Eventually, the repair becomes a template. Not emotionally, operationally. The repair showed you that every major task in a single operator life has the same structure. A primary action, a coordination layer, an authorization requirement, and a follow-up chain. And all four layers route through one person. The template applies beyond this property. The healthcare appointment has the same structure. The financial decision has the same structure. The legal document has the same structure. The career transition has the same structure. Primary action, coordination, authorization, follow-up. One person, every time. So the design question is not, how do I stop being alone? That question leads nowhere useful for a man who has built a functional, autonomous life and is not interested in dismantling it. The design question is, how do I add transfer paths to a system that currently has none? A transfer path is an engineering term. It means a route through which load can move from one structural element to another when the primary element is unavailable or overloaded. In a bridge, it's the secondary cable that takes tension when the primary cable stretches. In a building, it's the redundant beam that carries weight when the main beam is compromised. In a life, it's the mechanism by which a decision, a responsibility, or an authorization can move from you to someone else temporarily, specifically, and without surrendering control. That last part is critical. Transfer is not surrender. This is where most advice for single men goes wrong. It assumes that the solution to single operator overload is to stop being a solitary operator. Find a partner, build a community, join a group, open up, share. The advice treats autonomy as a problem to be solved rather than a design choice to be optimized. You chose this architecture, or it chose you, or some combination of circumstances and temperament and timing produced it. The origin doesn't matter for this purpose. What matters is that the architecture is yours, it works, and the goal is to make it more resilient without fundamentally changing its character. You don't need a co-pilot, you need an auxiliary system. Let's look at what that means concretely, not as a list of steps, not as a program, as a set of structural elements that exist in resilient single-operator systems and are absent in brittle ones. The first element is a decision map, not a to-do list. A map, a document paper or digital, it doesn't matter that answers one question. If I am unavailable for 2 weeks, what judgments need to be made, and who has the information to make them? This sounds simple. It is not, because mapping your decisions means making visible everything you currently hold in your head: the insurance policy number, the contractor's cell phone, not just his office line, the location of the shutoff valves, the name of your doctor, the account where the property tax autopay is set up, the login for the utility company website, the fact that the basement dehumidifier needs to be emptied every 3 days when it's running. None of this information is secret, but all of it is siloed. It lives in your head, in your phone, in your filing cabinet, in a password manager that only you can access. If you were unavailable, every one of these information nodes would become a locked door, and whoever was trying to help a friend, a neighbor, a hired property manager would spend their time breaking down doors instead of making decisions. A decision map doesn't require you to share it with anyone today. It requires you to create it, to externalize the operational knowledge that currently exists only in your cognition. The act of writing it down is itself a structural improvement, because it forces you to see the system as a system, rather than as a series of things you just know. The second element is a documented operating manual for the property, not a binder of manuals for each appliance, though that's useful. An operating manual for the house as a system. When was the roof last inspected? What's the HVAC maintenance schedule? Where are the access points for plumbing, electrical, and gas? What's the history of repairs, and which contractors did the work? A house with an operating manual can be maintained by someone other than its owner. A house without one can only be maintained by the person who holds all the knowledge in their head. The manual doesn't replace you. It makes your knowledge transferable. It means that if you need to delegate temporarily, for any reason, the person receiving the delegation has context. They're not starting from zero. The third element is a trusted contact structure. Not a support group, not a circle of intimates, a structure. Specific people assigned to specific functions, with clear boundaries that preserve your privacy while enabling continuity. This is where most men in this position resist, and the resistance is rational. Assigning someone a role in your life feels like an imposition. It feels like asking for something you shouldn't need. It feels like crossing a line that your identity has drawn firmly, the line between self-reliant and dependent. But a trusted contact structure is not dependence. It's governance. Every organization has a governance structure, a board, an executive team, a chain of command that can function when the CEO is on vacation. Your life is an organization. A small one, privately held, with a single executive. And that executive has no succession plan, no delegation authority, and no defined chain of command. The trusted contact structure doesn't have to be elaborate. It might be one person who has a copy of your house key and knows where the breaker box is. One person who is listed on your medical records as authorized to receive information. One person who has the password to your financial accounts in a sealed envelope, not to use, but to access in an emergency. These assignments can be made quietly. They can be made without explanation. They can be made without emotional disclosure. A man who values privacy can build a contact structure that respects that privacy completely. The structure is not about sharing your life. It's about ensuring that your life's critical systems don't stall when you're temporarily unable to operate them. The fourth element is the legal documentation. Power of attorney. Healthcare directive. A will that reflects your current wishes, not the one you wrote 15 years ago, or never wrote at all. These documents are not about death. They are about continuity. A healthcare directive doesn't say, "Here's what to do when I die." It says, "Here's what to do when I can't speak for myself." A power of attorney doesn't say, "I give up control." It says, "I designate control in advance so that when I need someone to act, the authorization is already in place." For a man who has spent his life being the authorization, creating these documents is an unusual act. It requires imagining a version of yourself that cannot authorize, not a diminished version, an unavailable one, temporarily out of the choice seat. And the discomfort of that imagination is real because the identity is built on being the one who decides. But here's the reframe that makes the discomfort manageable. Creating these documents is itself a decision, a significant one. It's the decision to design your system for continuity rather than leaving continuity to chance. It's not an admission of weakness. It's an act of governance. The most competent executives in the world have succession plans, not because they plan to leave, because they understand that planning for absence is part of responsible management. You are the executive of your own life. You've been an excellent one. And excellent executives plan for the scenarios they prefer not to encounter. Now let's talk about the identity shift that makes all of this possible without threatening the core structure. The current identity runs on a simple engine. I am the man who carries everything. That engine has been reliable. It has produced decades of stability. It is, in a very real sense, who you are. And nothing in what we're discussing requires dismantling it. But the engine can be upgraded without being replaced. The upgrade is a shift from "I am the man who carries everything" to "I am the man who designs systems that carry weight when I cannot." Read that again. It's not "I am the man who asks for help." It's not "I am the man who admits he can't do it alone." It's "I am the man who designs systems." The agency stays with you. The competence stays with you. The control stays with you. What changes is the scope of what you're controlling. Instead of controlling every individual task, you're controlling the architecture. Instead of being the labor, you're being the engineer. This is not a demotion. It's a promotion. The laborer carries the load. The engineer designs the system that distributes the load. Both are necessary. But at a certain point in any system's life cycle, the engineering matters more than the labor, because the labor is constrained by the body, and the engineering is not. The body will continue to have opinions. The knees will continue to comment on kneeling. The back will continue to report on lifting. The eyes will continue to negotiate with small print. These are not failures. They are operational parameters. And the engineer who designs around operational parameters, rather than ignoring them, builds a better system. Dignity stays intact through this transition because the transition is deliberate. You are not being forced into delegation by a crisis. You are choosing to build transfer paths because you've examined the architecture and identified the stress points. That's not need. That's foresight. And foresight, in any engineering context, is the highest form of competence. Let's go back to the financial layer for a moment, because the financial architecture mirrors the operational one. The property concentrates risk. We established that. Equity, liability, maintenance cost, physical safety, all in one address. The financial version of the resilience question is not, do I have enough money? For most men in this position, the answer to that question is yes, or close to yes. The financial question is my financial architecture designed to absorb timing risk? Timing risk is the risk that two or more financial stresses arrive simultaneously. The roof fails during a market downturn. The car needs replacing during the same quarter as a major medical bill. A career transition coincides with a property tax reassessment. Each of these events, individually, is manageable. The savings absorb it, the income covers it, the apparatus handles it. But when they overlap, when two or three arrive in the same 6-month window, the single income, single asset architecture feels the strain. Not because the total cost exceeds your resources, because the timing exceeds your cash flow. In a 2-income household, timing risk is partially mitigated by the second income stream. If one person's expenses spike, the other's income provides a buffer. In a single-income household, the buffer is savings. And savings, while real and valuable, are finite. They are a reservoir, not a river. They can absorb a spike, but they don't replenish themselves during the spike. The structural response to timing risk is not earning more. It's reducing what financial engineers call single-event volatility. That means ensuring that no single event, no one repair, no one medical bill, no one market movement can consume a disproportionate share of your financial capacity in a short window. This is achieved through mechanisms you may already have: insurance, emergency funds, diversified accounts, scheduled maintenance that prevents the catastrophic failure that costs 5 times as much as the preventive repair. These are not novel concepts, but framing them as volatility reduction rather than financial planning changes the way they feel. You're not saving because you're anxious. You're buffering because the system requires it. The same way the house requires a dehumidifier in the basement, not because something is wrong, because the architecture produces moisture, and moisture needs to be managed. The body enters the financial equation here too, because the body is a financial variable that most planning ignores until it asserts itself. Health care costs after 50 are not just medical expenses. They're operational costs. They affect your ability to work, to maintain the property, to drive, to manage the logistics of daily life. A knee replacement isn't just a medical event. It's a 6-week reduction in operational capacity. which means 6 weeks of modified systems, someone to handle the property, reduced ability to shop and cook, possible impact on work output, and the financial cost of the procedure, plus the financial cost of the capacity reduction. The body is treated, in most financial planning, as a constant. The plans assume a baseline level of health and functionality, but the body is not a constant. It's a variable with a known trajectory. It will require more maintenance. It will produce more interruptions. It will demand more resources, time, money, and attention with each passing year. And in a single operator system, every resource the body demands is a resource subtracted from every other system. The goal is not to fear this trajectory. The goal is to account for it. The way an engineer accounts for material fatigue in a structure, not with alarm, with calculation. The body will need more. The systems need to be designed to provide more without depending on the operator being at full capacity. This is where the existential layer integrates with the practical one, and it integrates quietly, without drama. Aging is not a mood. You've heard people talk about aging as if it's an emotional experience. Coming to terms with getting older, accepting your limitations. These phrasings treat aging as a psychological event, something you process, something you feel your way through. But aging is also perhaps primarily an operational event. It changes what the body can do per unit of time. It changes recovery rates. It changes risk profiles. It changes the cost-benefit calculation of every physical task. And these changes are not sudden. They're incremental. A 0.5% reduction in capacity per year doesn't feel like anything. It feels like normal. But compounded over a decade, it changes the operating parameters significantly. The building demands a flat line. It needs the same maintenance at year 25 as it did at year 5. The gutters are the same height. The furnace filter is the same size. The lawn grows at the same rate. The house does not adjust its requirements to match the operator's trajectory. And that gap between the place's flat demand line and the body's gradually declining capacity curve is the structural reality that no amount of willpower can override indefinitely. Willpower can close the gap for a long time. Discipline can close it. Stubbornness can close it. But the gap is real, and it widens at a rate determined by biology, not by character. The strongest response to this reality is not denial and not resignation. It's engineering. It's looking at the gap and asking, what can be redesigned so that the system's demands decrease as the operator's capacity decreases? What tasks can be automated? What maintenance can be professionalized? What physical demands can be reduced through structural modification? A different kind of gutter system, a different landscaping approach, a different relationship with the property that treats it as a managed asset rather than a personal proving ground. These are not concessions. They are design improvements. An engineer who automates a manual process isn't admitting defeat. He's increasing the framework's efficiency. A man who hires a lawn service isn't giving up. He's reallocating his limited operational capacity to higher value tasks. The math is simple. Your time and energy are finite resources that are becoming more scarce. Deploying them on tasks that can be delegated is an inefficient use of a constrained resource. The identity shift holds. You are not becoming less capable. You are becoming a better allocator of your capability. The difference between those two frames is the difference between erosion and optimization. One feels like loss. The other feels like what it is, the most competent move available. The quiet reconstruction is not a project with a deadline. It's a design orientation, a way of looking at the systems of your life and asking, at each decision point, not, can I handle this? But is this the best use of my operational capacity? The answer to, can I handle this, is almost always yes. That's not the relevant question. The relevant question is whether handling it yourself is the optimal allocation, or whether your capacity would be better spent on the determinations that only you can make, while delegating the rest to systems, services, or people who can execute without your constant involvement. That reallocation is the reconstruction, not tearing down what you've built, redistributing the load within it so that the structure can sustain itself over a longer timeline, longer than next year, longer than the next repair, long enough to account for the trajectory that biology has already determined. And the reconstruction begins not with action, but with a specific kind of clarity. The clarity of seeing the system as it is, not as it appears from the outside, not as the identity prefers to describe it, as it is, one operator, multiple systems. No transfer paths, high competence, low redundancy. That's the honest assessment. And honesty in engineering is not vulnerability. It's the foundation of every improvement that works. There's a moment in the reconstruction, if you can call it that, because it doesn't feel like reconstruction. It feels like a Tuesday afternoon where you happen to be thinking more clearly than usual, where something small happens that carries more weight than it should. You're sitting at the kitchen table. The contractor's form is still there, the legal pad with the project notes, the insurance correspondence, and you pick up a pen and write a name on the emergency contact line, not because someone told you to, not because you had a revelation, because you looked at the blank line and decided that a blank line is a design flaw, and you don't leave design flaws unaddressed. The name you write is someone you trust, not your closest friend, maybe not even someone you see regularly, but someone who is competent, local, and would pick up the phone. Someone who, if you called and said, I need you to let a contractor into my house on Thursday because I can't be there, would say, what time? Without making it into a conversation about your life choices. That's the profile, not a confidant, not a therapist, not a partner substitute. A competent person with a specific bounded role in your operational structure. The same way you'd choose a contractor, not based on friendship, but based on reliability, proximity, and the ability to execute without excessive supervision. You haven't called this person yet. You've just written the name. But writing the name changed something. Not emotionally, architecturally. The form has an answer now. The system has a node that isn't you. One node for one function. And that single addition shifts the entire risk profile of the property management system from total sole operator dependency to Single operator with one continuity mechanism. It's a small change. It might be the smallest possible structural improvement. But small changes in architecture have disproportionate effects on resilience. One backup cable on a bridge doesn't double the bridge's strength, but it eliminates the single point of failure. And eliminating a single point of failure is, in engineering terms, the highest value modification you can make. Now let's talk about what this moment actually costs. Because the resistance to it is real, and the resistance is not irrational. Writing that name required you to do something you almost never do. It required you to identify, explicitly, a gap in your own system, not a failure, not an inadequacy. A gap, a place where the design assumes a capacity that you may not always have. And identifying that gap, even privately, even on a form that no one else will see, brushes against the identity in a specific way. The identity says, I don't have gaps, I have solutions. Every problem that arrives gets solved. The gap and the solution happen so fast that the gap is never visible. It's like watching a skilled athlete recover from a stumble. The recovery is so immediate that the stumble barely registers. But this time, you let the gap stay visible for a moment. You looked at the blank line, and you didn't immediately fill it with your own name, or leave it blank and move on. You sat with it. You let it be a gap. And then you filled it with someone else's name. Not because you couldn't fill it with your own. Because filling it with your own would be the equivalent of listing yourself as your own emergency contact, technically an answer, structurally meaningless. That's the cost. A few seconds of seeing the operating structure clearly enough to act on what you see. The cost is not emotional vulnerability. It's architectural honesty. And architectural honesty, for a man who has been his own architect for decades, is a specific kind of discipline. It requires looking at your own work and saying, not this is wrong, but this can be improved. The best architects in the world revise their own designs, not because the original was flawed, because conditions change, materials age, loads shift, and a design that was optimal at one point in time may need modification to remain optimal at another. The revision is not an indictment of the original. It's an extension of the same competence that produced it. Let's extend this into the other systems, because the house is just the most tangible one. Healthcare. You've been your own medical advocate for your entire adult life. You schedule, you research, you make decisions about treatment, prevention, and follow-up. And you've done it well. The checkups happen, the screenings happen, the prescriptions are managed, the system runs. But the healthcare system after 50 has a feature that the healthcare system at 30 did not. It generates information that benefits from a second perspective. Not a medical perspective, you have doctors for that. A personal perspective. Someone who knows your patterns well enough to say, you've been putting off that follow-up for 2 months. That's not like you. Or someone who notices that you've been unusually tired, or that you've mentioned the same pain 3 times without acting on it, or that your appetite has changed in a way that you've normalized, but that, from the outside, looks like something worth mentioning. This kind of monitoring doesn't require a live-in partner. It doesn't require daily contact. It requires one person who sees you regularly enough to notice changes and is direct enough to name them. That person may already exist in your life. A friend, a sibling, a colleague, someone whose presence is consistent enough to serve as a baseline. The structural move is not to recruit this person into a formal role. It's to recognize that they already function as an informal monitor and to not push them away when they observe something. When that person says, "You seem off," the old response is, "I'm fine." The structural response is to treat the observation as data. Maybe the data is noise. Maybe you are fine. But dismissing the observation reflexively is the behavioral equivalent of ignoring a dashboard warning light because the engine still runs. The financial system. You've managed your own finances with the same discipline you've applied to everything else. But the financial system has a vulnerability that mirrors the healthcare one. It benefits from an external audit. Not because you're making mistakes, because concentration risk is difficult to see from inside the concentration. A man who has owned the same house for 20 years, invested in the same accounts, followed the same strategy, and managed the same budget can develop a kind of financial tunnel vision. Not incompetence, familiarity. The portfolio looks right because it has always looked like this. The allocation feels balanced because it has always been balanced this way. The risk profile seems appropriate because it was appropriate when you set it up 12 years ago. But 12 years ago, you were 12 years younger. Your time horizon was longer. Your earning capacity had more runway. Your physical ability to recover from a financial setback by working more, by taking on additional projects, by absorbing short-term discomfort was greater. The risk profile that was appropriate at 45 may not be appropriate at 57. Not because you made a mistake at 45, because the variables have changed. An external audit, a conversation with a financial professional, or even a structured self-review using updated parameters is the financial equivalent of the home inspection. It doesn't assume the dwelling is falling down. It checks whether the house has developed conditions that the owner, through daily familiarity, has stopped seeing. The career system. If work is still active, the structural question is succession. Not your succession from the role, though that may be relevant, but the succession of work's role in your identity. If work is carrying a disproportionate share of your social identity, your daily structure, and your sense of relevance, then the structural vulnerability is clear. When work changes, everything it was carrying falls. The engineering response is to build secondary load paths before the primary one shifts. Not after. Before. A secondary structure that provides social contact, daily rhythm, and a sense of contribution that doesn't depend on employment. This might be involvement with a professional association. It might be a skill you've been developing privately that could become a semi-professional pursuit. It might be a mentoring relationship where your expertise has value outside your current role. The specific form matters less than the structural principle. Identity load should be distributed across multiple supports so that the failure of any single one doesn't collapse the system. This is portfolio theory applied to identity. Don't put all your sense of self in one asset, the social system. This is the hardest one to redesign because social architecture is the most resistant to deliberate engineering. You can hire a financial advisor. You can schedule a medical appointment. You can write a name on a form. But you can't engineer a friendship. What you can do is remove the obstacles you've built against one. And the primary obstacle for most men in this position is the absence of contexts where social connection can develop organically. Work provides one context. But work friendships are structurally limited. They exist within the work system and often don't survive the transition out of it. The structural move is to create or maintain at least one social context that exists independently of work, a recurring activity, a regular commitment, something that puts you in proximity to the same people on a consistent basis, because consistency is the raw material of trust, and trust is the raw material of the kind of relationship that can eventually bear operational weight. This doesn't have to be social in the way that word is usually used. It doesn't have to involve emotional disclosure or group vulnerability or any of the things that make most men in this demographic quietly exit the room. It can be a woodworking shop where the same 6 guys show up on Saturday mornings. It can be a fishing group, a cycling route with regular riders, a volunteer commitment that repeats weekly. The content of the activity matters less than the structure. Same people, regular interval, shared task. Over time, not weeks, months, these contexts produce the kind of low-key relational infrastructure that a single operator life needs. Not deep friendship necessarily, functional trust. The kind where you can say, I need someone to check on my house Thursday, and the request doesn't feel extraordinary. It feels like what people in proximity do. Building this takes time. It takes a willingness to show up consistently, even when the immediate return is zero. It takes accepting that the investment is structural, not transactional. You're not going to the woodworking shop because today's session will change your life. You're going because the 47th session might produce a relationship that matters when you need it. That's a long game. And men who have been operating on immediate self-sufficiency for decades are naturally wired for long games that involve other people. The long games they play are financial compound interest, equity growth, career advancement. Applying the same patience to social infrastructure feels foreign. But the math is the same. Small, consistent deposits into a system over time produce a reserve that is available when needed. The financial version is a savings account. The social version is a trust network. Both require discipline. Both require patience. Both produce almost nothing visible in the short term, and both become invaluable under stress. Let's return to the structure one more time, because the house is where this started, and the home is where the reconstruction becomes most concrete. The repair is moving forward. The mold remediation is scheduled. The contractor has the scope approved. The insurance claim is in process. The wall will be closed. The sink will work again. The kitchen will look the way it looked before, and within a few weeks, there will be no visible evidence that any of this happened. But something has changed, not in the house, in the way you see the residence. Before the leak, the house was a stable asset managed by a competent owner. That's still true. But now, you also see it as a system with documented vulnerabilities. You see the one-person dependency. You see the authorization bottleneck. You see the physical demands that will increase as the body's capacity to meet them gradually decreases. You see the concentration of risk, financial, physical, operational in one address, one structure, one person. And you've started to build the first transfer paths. A name on a form, a folder with documentation that someone other than you could use to make decisions. The beginning of a decision map. Not complete, not perfect, but started. The identity hasn't changed. You're still the man who handles things, but the definition of handling has expanded. It used to mean carrying every load personally. Now it includes designing systems that carry load when you can't. The shift is subtle from the outside. From the inside, it's significant, because it means the identity is no longer tied to the labor. It's tied to the design. And design, unlike labor, doesn't degrade with age. Design improves with experience. The more you've carried, the more you understand about load distribution. The more systems you've operated alone, the more clearly you can see where the transfer paths should go. The decades of single operator management aren't a deficit. They're a dataset. They tell you exactly where the stress points are, because you've been the one absorbing the stress at every point. No one else has that knowledge. No financial advisor, no attorney, no contractor, no friend has the complete map of your system's vulnerabilities. Only you have it. Because you built the machinery, you operated it, and you felt every point with a load concentrated. That knowledge is the foundation of the reconstruction, not someone else's framework, not a checklist from a book. Your knowledge applied to your system by the person who understands it better than anyone. There's a moment not traumatic, not marked by anything external, where the reconstruction stops feeling like a concession and starts feeling like the most competent thing you've done in years, because it is. Building a system that can sustain itself without requiring one person to be at full capacity every day is harder than just carrying the load. It requires more thought, more foresight, more honesty about constraints, more creativity about solutions. It is, in fact, the hardest engineering problem you've faced. Harder than this property, harder than the career, harder than the financial plan. Because the system you're redesigning is your own life, and the constraints are not abstract. They're physical, temporal, and deeply personal. You write down the name of your doctor on the authorization map, the login for the insurance portal, the contractor's direct number, the location of the water shutoff, the gas shutoff, the breaker box. You note which bills are on autopay and which require manual authorization. You identify the 3 decisions that, if delayed by 2 weeks, would cause the most damage. And you ask yourself, if I were unavailable, could someone else make these 3 decisions with the information on this page? The answer right now is almost, not quite. There are still gaps. There are still pieces of knowledge locked in your head that haven't been externalized. But the document exists now. It didn't exist a month ago. And its existence changes the risk profile of your entire system. Not because anyone is looking at it, because you built it. And building it required the kind of clear-eyed assessment that most people single or partnered never perform. Most households run on assumption and habit. Yours is now starting to run on documentation and design. That's not a consolation prize for living alone. That's a structural advantage that emerged from the specific conditions of your life. You were forced to examine the architecture because there was no one else to absorb the load invisibly. And the examination produced something most people never develop: a fully mapped operational system with identified stress points and the beginning of handoff routes. The man who built this system alone is the same man who can redesign it, not because he failed, because he succeeded long enough to reach the point where the design needs updating. And updating a successful design is the most sophisticated engineering task there is. The strongest identity move in this entire process is the one that feels the smallest. It's allowing the system to have continuity without turning that continuity into a public narrative. You don't have to explain this to anyone. You don't have to announce that you've made changes. You don't have to frame it as growth or healing or any other word that belongs to a vocabulary you didn't choose. You just have to do it, quietly, the same way you've done everything else. The pen goes back on the table. The form has a name on it now. The folder has documentation. The decision map is started. And the house, the property, it started all of this with a slow drip under the sink on a Tuesday night. The house is still standing, still requiring maintenance, still indifferent to whether one person lives here or two. But the design that maintains it is slightly different now. One transfer path where there was none. One document where there was only memory. One name where there was only a blank line. Resilience is not optimism. It is transferable authority. That statement has been sitting in the background since it first appeared. Now it has weight. Because you've seen what non-transferable authority looks like. A system that works beautifully until the single authority is unavailable. And you've started building the mechanism that makes authority movable. Not permanently, not broadly. Just enough to keep the system running if you need a week off. A sick day, a recovery period, a breath. The reconstruction is not finished. It may never be finished in the way a project is finished. It's more like maintenance, ongoing, periodic, adjusted as conditions change. But the orientation has shifted, and the shift is permanent. Once you've seen the architecture clearly, you can't unsee it. Once you've identified the single points of failure, they stay identified. And once you've built the first transfer path, the second one is easier. Not easy, easier, because the identity has already absorbed the shift. The man who designs systems has already replaced the man who only carries loads. And the designer, unlike the laborer, gets better with time. The building is quiet again. The remediation is done. The wall is closed. The paint matches well enough that you'd have to know where to look to see where the patch is. The sink works. The cabinet panel was replaced. The new wood is slightly lighter than the old, but it'll darken over time. The bucket is back under the sink, not because it's needed, but because you keep it there now. A habit that formed during the repair and stuck. The kitchen looks the way it looked before the drip started. If someone walked in today, they'd see a clean, functional room in a maintained house owned by a man who takes care of things. They'd see stability, and they wouldn't be wrong. But you see something different now. You see the shut-off valve behind the cold water line that resisted before it turned. You see the cabinet panel that swelled because water had been traveling for weeks before it made itself known. You see the wall that opened and revealed damage that was invisible from the surface. And you see the form on the counter, not blank anymore, but filled in, with a name that means the system has one path it didn't have before. The repair is finished. What it exposed is not. What it exposed is the operating architecture of a life built on a single principle: I handle it, and the structural reality that emerges when that principle is examined under moderate stress. Not crisis, not catastrophe. A leaking pipe and the chain of logistics it produced. That was enough. That was the audit. The audit didn't find failure. Let's be definitive about that. The audit found a system that works. A system that has been working for decades. A system built by a man who understood, from early adulthood, that the most reliable way to ensure something gets done is to do it yourself. That understanding produced competence, discipline, a life that holds its shape without external reinforcement. These are not small achievements. In a culture that often measures adult success by partnership and household size, building a complete, stable life as a single operator is an act of sustained engineering that rarely gets recognized as such. The audit also found what all audits find in lone operator systems: no redundancy, no backup channels, no delegation architecture, no mechanism for continuity when the operator is unavailable. These aren't failures of character. They're features of the design. The design optimized for autonomy, and autonomy, by definition, means one. One decision maker, one executor, one person who knows where the shut-off valve is. The audit revealed 3 realities. None of them are emotional. All of them are operational. The first reality is that load exists whether or not it is shared. A man living alone carries the same categories of responsibility as a man living with a partner: property, health care, finances, career, social maintenance, daily logistics. The categories don't shrink because the household has one member. They consolidate. Every category roots through the same person. And the consolidation is invisible most of the time because the operator is efficient enough to process it without visible strain. But invisible load is still load. The cognitive weight of tracking 6 open threads: insurance, contractor, medical follow-up, financial review, work deliverable. That thing on the roof you haven't dealt with. It doesn't register as weight because it's distributed across days and weeks and months. Each individual thread is manageable. The aggregate is what creates the background hum. The low-grade, always-on processing state that feels like normal because it's been normal for so long. Acknowledging that load, not complaining about it, not asking for relief from it, just seeing it accurately, is the first operational insight. The load is real. It is carried by one person. And carrying it is an achievement that deserves to be recognized, if only internally, as the significant structural accomplishment it is. The second reality is that authority is a resource, and like all resources, it must be transferable to be sustainable. You are the authority in every system you operate. You authorize the contractor. You authorize the medical treatment. You authorize the financial resolution. You authorize the schedule. That authority is what makes the infrastructure responsive decisions happen fast because they don't require consensus. But authority that cannot transfer is authority that creates a bottleneck. When the single authority is occupied, depleted, or unavailable, the system doesn't slow down. It stops, not because it lacks resources, because it lacks authorization. The money is in the account. The contractor is available. The doctor has an opening. But nothing moves because the one person who can say yes is not in a position to say it. Transferable authority is not shared authority. It's not giving someone else permanent decision-making power over your life. It's creating a mechanism legal, practical, documented that allows someone to act in your name within defined boundaries for a defined period. It's the corporate equivalent of a delegation of authority letter. It doesn't diminish the executive. It extends the executive's reach beyond the physical limitations of one body and one calendar. Building that mechanism is one of the most deliberate acts of control a single man can exercise. It's not relinquishing control. It's projecting control forward in time into scenarios where your direct involvement may not be possible. It's governing in advance. And advanced governance is what separates a well-designed system from one that merely works under favorable conditions. The third reality is that aging is not emotional. It is operational. The body is a system component. It has performance characteristics that change over time, not precipitously, not catastrophically, but measurably. Recovery time lengthens. Energy allocation shifts. Physical capacity adjusts. These changes are as predictable as material fatigue in a structure, and they deserve the same engineering response, not alarm, not denial, but calculation. The calculation is straightforward. The body's capacity curve is declining gradually. The systems it operates, house, career, health, finances, social network, have demand curves that are flat or increasing. The gap between capacity and demand will widen. Not today, not this year, necessarily. But over the trajectory of a decade or two, the gap becomes significant enough that the system either adapts or strains. Adapting means redesigning the structure's demands to match the operator's evolving capacity. It means automating what can be automated, professionalizing what was previously done manually, documenting what was previously held in memory, building transfer paths that didn't exist when the operator was at peak capacity and didn't need them. This is not preparing for decline. This is designing for longevity. There's a difference. Preparing for decline is defensive. It assumes the worst and braces for it. Designing for longevity is proactive. It assumes that the system will continue operating for decades and asks, what does the system need to look like at year 15, year 20, year 25, to continue functioning at an acceptable level with an operator whose parameters have shifted? That question is the most forward-looking question a man in this position can ask. It doesn't dwell on what has been lost. It doesn't mourn what wasn't built. It takes the arrangement as it is functional, autonomous, well-maintained, and extends its operational life by improving its design. The same way a well-built house can last 100 years if its systems are updated to match changing conditions. You built the house, not just the physical one. The whole thing. The career, the finances, the routines, the daily architecture of a life that stands on its own. You built it with the tools you had, under the conditions you faced, using the skills you developed. And it stands? That's not nothing. In a world that often treats single men past 50 as incomplete projects, as cautionary tales, as evidence of something that went wrong, your life stands. Upright, maintained, functional, solvent, quiet. The most stable men in this position often don't fear being alone. That's the part the culture gets wrong. The culture assumes that a man living alone past 50 is battling loneliness, searching for connection, suffering in silence. Some are, but many are not. Many have made peace with solitude in a way that is genuine, not performative. The quiet of the house is not oppressive. It's operational. It's the sound of a system running smoothly. What these men fear, if fear is even the right word, and it probably isn't, it's more like a low-frequency awareness, is not being alone. It's becoming a problem. Becoming the person who can't manage. Becoming the person who needs to be managed. The person whose systems have failed visibly enough that someone else has to step in, not because they were invited, but because the situation demanded it. That's the actual concern, not loneliness, not isolation, not the absence of love, the loss of operational sovereignty. The moment when the man who handled everything becomes the man who can't handle this one thing, and that one thing cascades into a series of interventions he didn't authorize and can't control. System design prevents that, quietly, without performance, without announcement. A decision map prevents that because when someone does need to step in, they have a document that tells them what to do, how to do it, and where to find what they need. The intervention is guided, not chaotic. It follows your design, not someone else's improvisation. A trusted contact structure prevents that because the person who steps in was chosen by you, briefed by you, authorized by you. Not a stranger from an agency, not a distant relative making guesses. Someone you selected for competence and reliability, the same way you'd select a contractor. Legal documentation prevents that because the authority to act was transferred in advance, on your terms, with your boundaries. The power of attorney doesn't give someone else your life. It gives them a specific bounded permission that you defined while you are fully capable of defining it. These are not acts of surrender. They are the final expression of the same competence that built the system in the first place. The man who built a life alone is the most qualified person to design its continuity plan, because no one else understands the system the way he does. No one else knows where the shut-off valves are literal and figurative. No one else has the complete operational picture. That knowledge is not a burden. It's an asset. And deploying it, converting it from private knowledge into documented, transferable architecture is the highest value use of that asset, higher than carrying another load. higher than solving another problem manually, higher than proving one more time that you can handle it alone. You can handle it alone. That's established. That was never in question. The question was always whether this setup could handle it without you. And now, slowly, quietly, with the same discipline you've applied to everything else, you're building the architecture that answers that question. Not with optimism, not with hope, with design. The kitchen light is on. The sink works. The floor is dry. The bucket sits under the pipes empty, precautionary. A habit formed from a month of managing water that went where it shouldn't. The place is the same house it was before the leak. The man in it is the same man. But the system that connects the two, the invisible architecture of decisions, authorizations, schedules, and responsibilities, that system has a feature it didn't have before. A transfer path. One documented route through which authority can move when the primary operator is unavailable. One path. In a system that had none. The house doesn't know the difference. The dwelling processes water and electricity and heat the same way it did last month. It doesn't register the change in governance. It just runs. But the man who operates it knows. He knows because he built it. The same way he built everything else. Alone. Deliberately. On his own terms. A house that depends only on you is not a home system until it can keep functioning when you are temporarily unavailable. That was the question the leak posed, standing in the kitchen at 11 at night with water running where it shouldn't and 2 towels on the floor and a bucket that wasn't big enough. The bucket was never the problem. The system was. And the architecture now has the beginning of an answer. Not a complete answer, not a permanent one. An answer that will need revision as conditions change, because conditions always change and design is never finished. But an answer that exists where there was none. A document where there was memory. A name where there was a blank line. A delegation path where there was only a single point of dependence. The light in the kitchen is still on. The house is quiet. And the man sitting at the table, pen down, folder closed, is not the same operator he was a month ago. Not because he changed who he is, because he extended what his competence can reach, past his own availability, past his own presence, into the territory where the system runs not because he is there, but because he designed it well enough to run when he is not. The structure will need him again. Tomorrow, next week, next season. Something will shift, something will demand attention, and he'll handle it. The way he always has. But somewhere in the file cabinet, in a folder with a label he chose, there is a document that says, if he can't, here's what happens next. That document is not weakness. It is the most precise form of strength a single operator can build.